Okay, we're back from our break, and actually we found some of the answers to a couple of questions. There doesn't seem to be anything in here about infertility among women, and there's no comment about infertility among women, but there is just a little bit about homosexuality, and not between women, but between men. And I don't know why I skipped over this part or didn't write it down, but accusations of homosexuality were considered terrible insults to men, and they were often made as insults to men by accusing them of being effeminate. However, there were laws in the Gragos against homosexuality, and the punishment for homosexuality, for committing homosexual acts, was exile. So it was actually against the law. There also are a couple of accounts, but not very many of them, and there's one case where one account has actually been erased from one of the sagas, describing voracious men who are bisexual essentially and are simply sexually voracious. But it's looked at as obscene, as being obscene. It's frowned on. It's not looked at as legitimate in the society, and not part of the socially acceptable things to do, because reproduction, and that makes sense. It makes sense in that kind of a society which functions really on the edges of famine at every moment. The land is so poor, the weather is so bad, the conditions are so difficult, that reproduction has to be central to the whole society for the community to maintain itself. So it would naturally frown on homosexuality. It would not want to tolerate it in that society, and so there's no hint of it among women that I could find just in a cursory look at the book. There also wasn't anything about infertility among women. I just don't know. I mean, you'd think that they would notice it, because these women were having 20 children in their lifetimes. There was one case that she describes in all of this, and she's, if you want to read about explicit descriptions of sexual relationships, they're in here as far as she can find them. And I left them out of the lecture, however. But she does try to go in and trace everything as closely as she can. And she tells one story of a man who was impotent with his first wife. And she told her father, my husband is impotent. And in essence, that's what she told her father. And then her father told her how to divorce him, because this was not acceptable. She had to have children, and it was very important. There was something about her, however, because he went on and married 2 other wives and had 20 children by each of them. So it's a wonderful story. So why he was impotent at one time and not at another time, I don't know. Your guess is as good as mine. But she goes into quite a lot of detail in this book if you haven't read it yet. Yeah, question?
Just thinking that possibly the lack of them talking about infertility could be cause for, environmental effects of women today.
That's really a good point, that in our society today, there would be many more possibilities of being infertile because of environmental impacts than in a society that lived closer to nature and without pollution and without the kind of disadvantages our society has. So maybe it wasn't so common in those days. And also, if women were married off as soon as they were able to bear children. I mean, 12-year-olds and 13-year-olds and 14-year-olds, they started having children the minute it was possible for them to have children. And so they would have a long span of their life in childbearing. And Nowadays, women put it off until they're much older. And also, the younger you have children, the longer you're capable of having children. So, so that has something to do with it too, that maybe it wasn't that much of a problem in those days as it is in our time when we're so concerned about infertility rates. That's a good point. Okay, well, let's kind of look at the women's function within the society, and I'm going to turn to Jenny Jawkins, and at this point I had gotten about halfway through her book, and look at this section up until the end of the book, too, and not really looking at her appendices, and also consider Judith Jesch's book. She goes on to discuss the Icelandic Society and says the Icelanders abandoned the Norwegian class differences, and in Iceland the tendency of the development of society was toward a freer society, so that there were only two classes, the free and the unfree, the slave and the free, and Iceland was so sparsely populated that the slaves were soon freed and became tenant farmers, and the tendency of natural development in Iceland was for slavery to disappear. And this was really true in medieval Europe as well, that Christianity mitigated against slavery, and slavery quite quickly had disappeared by the time we're looking at the Viking era. In Christian Europe, the Viking slavery was looked at as hideous by the Christians. They looked at this Christian. The Christians looked at the manifestation of slavery among the Vikings as something really horrible, and so they wouldn't tolerate it. But in Iceland, new classes were formed. The tendency was toward equality, but the richer males were devoted to politics and leisure. Everyone had to work, and there was not much leisure time, however, except in the winter when you know there was long hours of daytime when nobody could really do anything. But everyone had to work hard. Work was very gender specific. And according to the law, men did outside work and women did inside work. In the frontier era in Iceland, though, everybody worked, and women would do outside work as well as inside work when the labor was needed. In leisure time, men were active in sports and games and telling stories, and and in Ale Saga you saw that there were sporting contests, there were running contests, there were swimming contests, and so they had a lot of sports that they engaged in, telling stories, and also word games and intellectual games of all kinds. And you can see why they would engage in that. Here is a Viking, we've looked at this before, this is a Viking settlement. It's only one house and very few people, some boats, and this is a very small, isolated settlement. Here's another view of it. You can see the little house and the few boats having to do with this settlement. But if they had a long house like this, an extended family would live in it, so it would be a large extended family that would live in the house. This is that model house that I've shown you before, and here is the interior of it. And the reason I'm showing you this picture again is I was here in March, and it was a very bright day outside, but there are no windows in this house. It's very dark inside, and even if you had a fire, it would still be very dark and gloomy. And so that how could you possibly play a lot of these games? I mean, how could you do anything where you had to see a lot of things? And so this is quite interesting to kind of understand the kind of games they played. They played word games, they played relationship games, they played riddles, they played with riddles and that kind of a game. And so I brought some of these riddles to kind of read to you to see if you can figure out what they are. And just imagine sitting in this house and it's very dark and cold and you have this fire, and so you have to do things with your intellect, with your wits, and keep your wits about you, and really exercise your wits. Okay, here are some riddles that you might have. Let me get one that's good. I went from home, I traveled from home, I looked on the road of roads. Road was above, road was beneath, and road in every direction. Okay, that's the riddle. And the answer is a bird. A bird flew above, a fish swam beneath. Thou walkest on a bridge. Okay. What kind of drink was it I drank yesterday? It was neither water nor wine, mead nor ale, no kind of food. However, I went thirstless thence. And the answer is, you went into sunshine, you hid yourself in the shade, there fell dew in the valleys. Then you tasted the night dew, cooling your throat by it. Okay, that's the answer to the riddle. Who is the shrill one that on hard roads walks, on which he has been before? He kisses rather roughly, has two mouths, and walks on gold only. The answer is, the hammer walks on the fire of Rin. It sounds loudly, falling on the anvil. Okay, Rin is the Rhine River, the river of fire. Okay, that's a more obscure one, but it's a hammer, okay. What wonder is that which I saw outside before the door of Delling, and Delling is a rock before his door on the ground. What wonder is that which I saw outside before the door of Delling, two lifeless ones and breathless, seethed wound leak? And the answer is, there is neither breath nor heat in the bellows of smiths. They have neither life nor power. However, one can before them make a sword by the wind they give. Okay, so the answer is a bellows, a blacksmith's bellows. What wonder is it I saw outside before the doors of Delling? It has 8 feet, eyes 4, and bears its knee higher than its belly. And the answer is, from east you went to the door of a house to see the hall. You came there too where the king of webs wove a web from its bowels. Okay, the king of webs is a spider. And that's the answer, a spider. What wonder is it I saw outside before the doors of Delling? It turns its head on the way to hell and its feet to the sun. Okay, the answer is, the head of the leek turns toward the bosom of the earth and its leaves into the air. So the answer is a leek. It's the answer to that riddle. What wonder is it I saw outside before the doors of Delling? Harder than horn, blacker than raven, brighter than shield, straighter than shaft. And the answer is, now thy riddle making begins to slacken. Why should a ready man tarry? You looked on the roads, there lay raven flint, glittering in a sunbeam. Okay, I don't get that one. Raven, okay. Two bondwomen, light-haired maidens, carried ale to the skemma, and the skemma is a woman's house. It was not touched with hand, nor with hammer shaped. The wave-breasting one who made it was outside the islands, and the islands are on the sea. Okay. The answer is, white feathered skin have the swans, which by islands sit on the sea. Nests they built, had no hands, with other swans' eggs begat. Okay, so the answer to that riddle is a swan. They're a little obscure for us, but you see how they're exercising their wits and they're playing word games, and I mean, this is very important to them, to be intellectually sharp and to be sharp-witted and to be very witty as well, to play word games and to turn words and turn a jest. Here is a dice cube. Somebody asked last week about dice when we were talking about the little amber figures, and we were trying to figure out what they were. And somebody guessed they might be dice, but they actually had dice that looked like dice. I mean, and they would often gamble, and they would roll the whole kingdom. Here's a story about a king who gambled his whole kingdom away with dice in this story of the saga that goes with this dice cube. Okay, so the men would spend their time drinking and jesting and composing poetry, lazing in bed, and politics. And according to Jenny Jockins, women mostly worked. Well, you know, I think the women sort of participated in this as well, but women could actually play chess, and they must have had some occupation. I think that it must not have been reported. But the women ran the farm, the women ran the business, and it was run by a nuclear family. Women went to bed later and arose earlier than men. Men would get involved in sports and games and swimming and a kind of hockey. They had ball games and horse fairs and fights. They had horse races. They played board games and chess, and women played those kinds of board games and chess. It's quite interesting, but men were very athletic and very athletically active, but they had to train themselves for the hard kind of outside work they had, so it kind of makes sense. And the women might have worked in the fields when it was necessary, but they didn't do the athletic training that men did. Women were reputed for their knowledge of past events, so that they were the historians. They were the ones who remembered things. Public performances of things like poetry were only by men, but women also could participate in storytelling or poetry. They just didn't do it publicly. Drinking and word games and drink fest were the most important diversion, and they had seasonal feasts. And last time I gave you a list of all the holidays so that you could see what the holidays were. And on specific days of midsummer and midwinter and the autumnal equinox and the spring equinox were big feast days. And they celebrated everything they could with feasts, and they drank all the time. And we've already seen they drank a lot. I mean, they really drank a lot. We saw an ale saga. Remember, how old was he the first time he got drunk? Does anybody remember? I think it was 3 or 6. He went to a party, got drunk, threw up all over the place. But he was constantly doing that. That's the kind of, I mean, they just really go in for a lot of drinking and feasting. Later, all of these commemorative events, these seasonal events, were later associated with Christian events. For example, Christmas takes place at the same time of Yule as the midwinter feast. And they even still call it Yule in England. And in some of the Scandinavian countries, in England, they burn the Yule log. Okay, here I wanted to show you these chess pieces, and this is a photograph of various kinds of chess pieces that they would have played chess with, and women would have played chess as well with these game pieces. So they had board games of various kinds. Chess was the most popular that they played, and of course it's a war game. It's a strategic game of strategy. Well, all private events were toasted with drink, and it was an elaborate drinking culture. And women customarily served the drink to the men. Women would always be the ones who served the drink, but they always drank in pairs, and women drank too. I mean, it was just a very hard drinking society, and they constantly gave witty toasts were made, and you saw how huge those drinking horns were. They usually passed them around, but sometimes they had to different people had to drink them all in one draft. They proposed toasts, they made witty toasts, they played word games, they had jokes, they had sarcasm, they had plays on words. They were very into these witty kind of word games that they constantly played while they were drinking. Grief was expressed in songs of lament for men, but women still worked. The men were most involved in the political life. The men ran the meetings at the Althing and the local assemblies as active executors of justice. and receivers and supplicants. Jenny Jockins calls this non-productive male activities. However, I don't think politics are non-productive. I mean, I think you need order in society, and you need a way to have a politically ordered society. But the kind of work that it took just to feed and clothe people took both men and women. An unmarried woman would hire a manager for her farm to take care of the stock and to plant the crops and to do the outside work and manage the servants or the slaves. And likewise, an unmarried man would have to hire a housekeeper to do the job that a wife customarily would do, which would be the inside work, the management of the stores over the winter. And think about it for a minute. When winter lasts from basically September to May, and you only have like 3 months of summer, in that 3 months of summer you have to get all the food to feed the family for a year. You have to plant it, you have to harvest it, you have to preserve it one way or another to last through that enormously long winter. So it's a huge burst of activity that they all go into, a really mobile mode in the summer. And when the men are away vicking, the wife is in charge of seeing that all of that is done. And so whether there are servants, then the wife has to see that all the crops are planted and that the food is preserved for the winter. Okay. Okay, here is a drinking horn. And this is an ivory one. It has wonderful carvings on it. It's such a neat drinking horn if you're able to see it. And it has hunting scenes on it and fighting scenes, so it's a really exciting one. Unmarried men, as I said, hired a housekeeper, and the housekeeper was the single prestigious female position on a farm. The wife was the queen of that house, and she took charge of everything that meant the survival of that family. The men were in charge of everything outside, and the women were in charge of everything inside the house. Men's work had to do with dealing with nature directly, sowing the grain, digging and fertilizing the fields, animal husbandry, taking care of the cattle, the sheep, the pigs, and the birds, branding and fencing, cutting brush and wood, making charcoal, fishing, and collecting eggs. So this would be the kind of men's work that would be done. Women's work was the processing of these crops and products, converting the results of male work for consumption and preservation. And you know, this leaves out a lot of the work of hunting. Not only did men take care of domesticated animals, but especially in Norway, where the fields were very, very few and far between, and they didn't have a lot of fertile farmland, hunting and fishing were far more important than in Sweden, where they had some fields, and in Denmark, where they had a lot more fields. And here are the men going out hunting animals of various kinds. Scenes on this drinking horn. We saw the golden drinking horn and how important it was to hunt the beasts of the field. This is interesting. It's a bundle of bronze keys, and the wife would have the keys to the storehouse, and the storehouse was the only room in the whole complex of the community or the farm that would be locked, and the woman had those keys, and she would be in charge of storing all the food and handing it out and parceling it out through the winter. Those don't look like real keys. That it's a bunch of keys on a kind of ring here, and these look like strange keys, but here is a key of bronze, and this one it belonged to a very rich woman. It was found with buckles and pearls and jewels and things of that sort. This looks more like a key that we're familiar with. And so fishing was very important. Our director, Don, won't let me bring food in here, so I brought pictures of food. Here is the fish that we... Oh, you're welcome. We wouldn't want to spill it on the technology here. Okay, salmon. So salmon and various kinds of fish. This is salmon. were the lifeblood of everything that went on in the Viking household. The wife was in charge of the dairy operations, the milking of the cows and the ewes, and the processing of the milk and the curds and the hard cheese and butter. And of course, milk doesn't last very long. It doesn't stay fresh, so you have to convert it into something that will keep. And curds, like cottage cheese, will make a soft cheese. And if you store the hard cheese, if you store the milk with the right enzymes, it'll turn into hard cheese as it ages. Butter will last virtually forever if you salt it really heavily. The wife was also in charge of the laundry and bathing on Saturdays. And remember the days of the week I gave you, that Lager Day is Saturday. Saturday was wash day. And so the wife would wash the clothes, and then she would wash the men and the children as well. And so she would be in charge of the cleanliness. The social activities that were carried on, the political deals and the gossip, were attended to by both men and women, but the women did the grooming. They helped bathe the men and the children, and they did the hair washing. Women, of course, cooked and served meals. And one of the things I found in my research, which was very odd, and maybe you all can help me sort of figure out why this might be so, but they actually ate a lot of things cold. They had hot dishes, but usually it would be like only one hot dish per meal, and they would have more of a cold table. They had a lot of cold food that they ate. A lot of their recipes were meant to be cold. And could this be because it was so hard to tend the fire, or because they tended to eat, they lived in such a cold climate? I mean, what do you all think? Why do you think they would eat so many things cold? I was just sort of trying to puzzle it out myself. Any ideas? What?
It wouldn't have been due to a lack of fuel, correct?
It depends on where you are. I mean, in Iceland it might have been due to a lack of fuel, but this is also true of Norway and Sweden, where they had plenty of timber. Plenty of timber. I just wonder if it was so hard to go out and get more fuel in the middle of winter. Of course, the ice and snow didn't stop them, really. And they had that fire. I showed you the inside of the house. There's a fire right in the middle of the house, and they had no chimneys, and they would, of course, keep the fire going for warmth, which would allow them to cook things. I mean, you would think they would want to eat something hot, as cold as it was in the winter. What do you think, Libby?
Well, there could be a couple of advantages to it. I don't know if they would be causes, but if they wanted to have a long meal, especially during the winter, while they're talking and drinking at the same time, they wouldn't want something that's meant to be hot, because then it would get cold and not taste as good.
Oh, well, that's a good idea.
And also,
Yeah.
if the women had to serve the meals, maybe they had to wait until the men had everything they wanted before they could sit down to eat. So if it was supposed to be cold, they wouldn't suffer from eating something that was supposed to be warm but had gotten cold by that time.
Yeah, that would be, I mean, one idea. They did have long feasts that lasted for a long time. And something that is kind of related to that is the smorgasbord, which is a cold table. I mean, virtually everything is cold except for one hot dish. And they would have things like jellied eggs or eggs in aspic, and they would have cucumber salad and beet salad. I mean, they really had a lot of cold dishes that were common in the culture. It just seemed odd to me, because I would think that they would rather prefer hot dishes, but maybe there are some hot dishes, though. There are stews and casseroles and things of that sort. It just seemed very odd. But women cooked and served the meals, and so they would be in charge also of parceling out the food and making the food last all winter. And remember, we have these enormously long winters that they have to cope with. The women helped people in and out of their clothes, and the women were in charge of the food. Interestingly, bread never became a staple among the Vikings, and this is quite odd. And I was comparing Viking food with modern ideas of nutrition. Grain was used for gruel and porridge and brewing, but they didn't use wheat because they couldn't grow wheat that far north. They used barley and oats. fish was extremely important in the daily diet, and they dried it and stored it inside the house. I really blew it because I had seen some Norwegian dried fish, and they're whole dried fish at Central Market, which has everything. and so I should have gone and gotten the fish, but they dried it and they stored it in the house for the winter. Dairy products and meat and milk and butter and cheese, of course, they could store. For meat, they had cows, sheep, horses, and pigs. They tended not to eat the cows and the sheep because the cows and the sheep produced milk and wool. Horses they would eat, but horses were valuable for riding. Pigs, they ate a lot of pork, and pork was the most often eaten of the meats that they had. Here's a bone comb that they might use when shampooing their husbands' and children's hair, and presumably their own as well. Here's a bone comb, and here is an iron comb for the combing and the grooming. Here again is our salmon, which they would have cooked, or they did a lot of food they ate without cooking. They pickled it, or they pressed it, and they salted it, and so they would simply eat it that way. Men slaughtered the animals, and women cut up the meat, and the meat was always boiled and not roasted. And we talked about that last time. We talked about society, and people mentioned the fact that roasting would make smoke go out in the room, and boiling would be a much more efficient way to take care of the food. Fish in the food and the diet, fish was of primary importance, and the kind of fish that they ate were salmon and herring and mackerel, which were oily fish which did not dry well, and that's the kind of fish they pickled or they pressed or they smoked it. Gravlax is famous for this kind of pressed fish. The other kinds of fish, like cod and haddock and pollock and ling, they would preserve by smoking and drying in the cool, crisp air with a stiff breeze. And this was called stockfisk, which was cod dried on wooden racks, and it was a cheap and almost indestructible food reserve. Here's a comment on 10 to 12-year-old stockfish of this kind, which was an enormous trading commodity, which they traded all over the North Sea. It behooves to beat it with a wooden hammer for a full hour and then set it to soak in warm water for a full 2 hours or more. Then cook it and scour it very well. The end product was best eaten with mustard or soaked in butter, probably to disguise it. But if it would keep, this dried fish would keep 10 to 12 years. And so you could freeze things as well, and so you could put things out in the snow to be frozen, but in hope that the animals wouldn't get them. So they put them in the houses and stored them. I am guessing that these would be the kinds of cooking pots that they might use. Here is a bronze kettle. And here are some small clay vessels, which this large one they might have used like to store grain or vegetables in. And if any of you have stored vegetables, if you've lived in the north, how many of you have lived in the north in a snowy, cold climate? I used to live in upstate New York, and in a place like that, in the basement, you can store apples and turnips and carrots and potatoes, but of course the Vikings didn't have potatoes, but you can store those things all winter long in that cold, dry air, and they will keep. And so foods of that kind they could store over the winter, and they might put it in a pot like this to store it, and this might be the kind of a pot they would cook in. Okay, pork was of supreme importance, and they smoked bacon and ham, and that's still a very famous northern food. They also had something called Swartsopa, which was blood soup, and in the book I was using, I might mention this book that I'm using as one of my sources. I had to really scrounge around to find this information out, but Food and History is a kind of interesting book written by an English woman, and I found some interesting things in here. It wasn't as thorough as I would have wished, however, but it was interesting. She mentions Swartsopa, a blood soup, and she thinks the Vikings may not have cooked it, that they just drank blood. I don't know about that, but there is a dish called Swartsopa, and they may have drunk it at the autumn slaughter, according to her findings. In the extreme north, and this would be like northern Norway, Trondheim, and in that area, famine was often so near when spring came that the cattle were skeletal from a winter diet of straw and shredded bark, and they had to be carried out to pasture. And in fact, it was so crucial to feed those animals with hay and shredded bark and anything they could eat over the winter, that in fact one of the colonies in Iceland perished because they simply did not provide for the animals over the winter. They didn't take care of it. In the very short summer, remember that anything that could be dried, smoked, or salted took top priority, and this included fish and whale and pork. And one of the delicacies, I'm told, in Iceland, one of my friends who went to Iceland and stayed there for a while said that when you go to Iceland, you must try blubber. And she said, it's very chewy and gelatinous. Okay, here are some Viking foods. Actually, this was my dinner last night, part of it. And salmon with the ever-present dill, which is the most popular herb or seasoning of the Scandinavians. And here are some red cabbage and apples. Here are some turnips, some cabbage. This is barley, and I'm going to show you some close-ups of these, and of course apples, which would be ever-present. This, by the way, is a Danish plate that shows a symbol of summertime activities. It's a later medieval plate, however. Okay, some of the things they ate, and it took me a while to compile this list, and I was very thorough. I used this, and I have another big book on food and history, which was too heavy to carry. But I also have this little Scandinavian cookbook, which is written by a Scandinavian and is the traditional recipes, so I drew some from this. I also used this book, which is fairly battered. It's a very old German cookbook, and so there are some similarities in Germanic cooking and Scandinavian cooking, and so I drew from this one as well. And then I found this wonderful book on home cheese making and how to make cheese. It's very interesting how you make cheese. And of course, it's very time-consuming and difficult to make cheese. It's not an easy thing to do, so these housewives would have had to do that. Here is a lady dressed like a Scandinavian, perhaps, making the cheese. Okay, here are the kinds of foods they eat, and I think I've got a pretty comprehensive list of everything they ate. Game, including rabbits, hares, pigeons, and robins. Robins are pretty big birds, by the way, as big sometimes as pigeons or doves. They would eat wild boar and bear. In my German book, there are recipes for wild boar and bear steak. There's a recipe for beaver, but I don't know if the Scandinavians ate beaver or not. They would eat chicken, duck, goose, and partridges, reindeer and eels, lobster, shrimp, and mussels, any kind of shellfish along the shore, beets and cabbage and onions and leeks, turnips and carrots would have been the major vegetables that they would have, and these are all root vegetables that will store over the winter very well in the cold, dark basement or storeroom that they would have. Cheese and butter would keep virtually forever in the cold air. The fruits they have, as far as I can track them all down, were apples and plums and cherries, which grow beautifully in the north, especially apples, but rose hips, and they would make rose. You know what rose hips are? When you have a rose on your rose bush, and if you leave it on the rose bush until the petals fall off, there'll be a big bulbous thing where the rose was. That's a rose hip. And they would use that for desserts. They would make a tea out of it and things of that sort, and use it as a flavoring for rose flavor things. They had a proliferation of berries. I don't know why berries grow so wonderfully in the north, but they had raspberries and blackberries and strawberries and lingonberries, bilberries, which are something like blueberries, elderberries, which are something like blackberries, and red currants and black currants, walnuts and hazelnuts and chestnuts. So they have a huge variety of foods that grow in the northern climate. And in the spring, the countryside would burst lushly into bloom, as it does in the northern climates, because the summer is so short. As soon as the snow is gone, everything just bursts into bloom. And the spring greens, of course, they would just gobble up, having gone through the winter without any greens of any kind, anything like salad. So spinach and watercress and dill and caraway. Probably they ate beet greens, which are, one variety is often called chard, which we eat in our salads now and or cook as a vegetable, and mustard greens. They probably ate those because I imagine they ate everything edible, and we know those things are edible, and you can make a salad out of them. And when you look at the medieval recipes for salad, they basically specify greens of all kinds, wild greens that you gather. Here is some watercress that they might have gathered by the creek sides or by the side of streams where it grows very nicely. And of course, all of Scandinavia is interlaced with waters and streams and rivers and lakes of all kind. Here is a lovely red cabbage with its outer leaves on, very dark leaves on the outside. And then here in this picture, you can see it's been cut into. Here are eggs, of course, and turnips, again, I mentioned. The soft cheeses like cottage cheese with berries and cheese and butter would be the kind of thing they would eat. Some of the other vegetables they would eat would be asparagus and parsnips and mushrooms and rutabagas. Parsnips are... they look kind of like white carrots, only they're bigger, and they're really quite delicious. Mushrooms, of course, and rutabagas are kind of like large turnips, big, large, fleshy turnips. Beer, of course, was liquid bread, and so they would save a lot of the grain to make beer with, or porridge for the babies or the old people. Here's a recipe for beer. 2 pounds of barley or rye meal, that should be stuffed into a bucket full of water with half a pound of salt and honey as available. Keep it warm overnight, stir it and let it settle. Pour off the liquid and then keep it for a few days while it ferments, and then it's ready to drink. And this would have been a lightly fermented thirst quencher, almost non-alcoholic, unless the honey content was high. And so often they would add fruit to it to raise the alcohol content, because they needed the sugar to get more alcohol when you ferment the beer. So that's a basic recipe for beer. It's very easy to make. They also would have made apple cider, because if you leave apples to ripen and get very soft and mushy, and they will ferment and they will turn into cider. And so I'm sure they learned the secret of cider very quickly. My guess is that they use so much vinegar in everything. They use vinegar to pickle their fish, and to pickle the beets, and to pickle the turnips, and to pickle the cucumbers. And so they must have made cider vinegar, because it's too far north really to grow grapes for wine. So they must have used cider vinegar. From dairy products, they made taeda, a kind of yogurt or curds or cottage cheese, which you can make by fermenting the cheese, and then it solidifies, and then the transparent liquid called the whey they would also drink, because it's very nourishing. It has a lot of vitamins in it. And when they stored their milk in animal stomachs, especially calves' stomachs, and in untanned leather pouches, these contain rennet, and it would produce curdling, and leaving it in there a long time would make it age and produce hard cheese. And so when you leave, you have to get the right enzymes for your cheese to turn it into the particular kind of cheese that you have. And so you save your bacteria that goes with your cheese to ferment it and turn it into the kind of cheese you want. So that certain caves where they might keep the cheese for a long time would have the right bacteria to make cheddar or blue cheese or Roquefort or Camembert or whatever kind of cheese they were trying to make. Here is the barley, the grains of barley, and if you can see, it's much different than wheat, but barley has its own particular texture. Some of the favorite dishes of Scandinavia, which were usually very simple, were a Danish liver pate, which is just a very simple pate. It's not all fancied up like the French pate, but more like liverwurst. I mean, a really simple liver pate. They ate open sandwiches of all kinds because they didn't eat a lot of bread, so they would just put one piece of bread and maybe pile different ingredients on it, like prawns or smoked salmon or roast beef or chicken or liver pate or cheese. They eat a lot of omelets, and we were talking last time about whether they had eggs or not. I'm certain they had eggs, and somebody emailed me and mentioned to me that that they noticed in Ale Saga that eggs were mentioned. So, but Ale Saga is 13th century again. I'm sure they had eggs. They would have used eggs. They make omelets, and in fact, when I was in Denmark, it was one of the standard dishes that you might have for lunch was a great big omelet. They also have a particular kind of yellow pea soup that they would cook with ham or bacon. Lamb and cabbage casserole, a pickled cucumber salad where there would be sliced cucumbers in vinegar, and they pickled beets in the same way. Here's the recipe for gravad lox. And originally, the Scandinavians seem to have buried the salmon to preserve it. But what they would do is take the raw salmon and slice it into fillets, and then heavily salt it, and then have a thick layer of dill, which they would put the salmon on top of the dill, and then more dill on top of the salmon, and then layer more salmon, this is raw salmon, on top of the dill, so that it would be just a lot of the dill and salt and salmon. And then they would put a heavy weight, wrap it in aluminum foil was this recipe, and then put a heavy weight on top of it to press all the salmon down, and press it for 36 to 48 hours in a cool place, and then you unwrap it and slice it and eat it. Okay, this is what you do instead of cooking it. It's a way to preserve it. Interesting way to preserve it. Other ways are smoking it and salting it. Here is some salmon that they might press into that kind of a gravad lox. And here are apples, which they would have eaten tons of. They would have eaten lots and lots of apples. I didn't have any cherries. They also make a kind of fish mousse out of milk or cheeses like cottage cheese. Eel steamed in beer was one of the recipes I found. Fresh prawns in dill and mustard sauce. Pickled herring, of course, which would be pickled with vinegar, and sometimes mustard sauce on that, dill sauce. Swedish meatballs, which were not in a sauce, interestingly. They were not served in a sauce, but they were cooked like a stew. And then a really interesting roast pork recipe with prunes and apples that sounded quite good to me, with the prunes and apples baked with them. A sailor's stew, which was beef and onions cooked in beer. And that sounds like a Viking sailor's stew. Red cabbage and apples. Apple pudding, which was apples layered with dark rye breadcrumbs that they would then bake. And it sounded very good, actually. Katrin plummen soufflé would be prunes and whipped egg whites, which would make a kind of soufflé. And the classic fruit soup, which was a thickened, sweet, cooked fruit mixture. especially served at holidays, and glögg, of course, was originally hot spiced wine. Later on, later on in the Middle Ages, when hard liquor, distilled spirits were invented, they used half wine and half aquavit, which would have been hard liquor, in the glögg. For flavorings, to flavor the food, they had a very simple cuisine. They didn't use a lot of different spices and flavorings, but mostly caraway seeds, dill, horseradish, and mustard. They also used bay leaves and juniper berries and parsleys. And so these were the kind of foods and spices they had. And so here is some cabbage and apples. This is such a simple recipe. You just get the cabbage and the apples and a little sugar and vinegar and steam it all together. And it's a very simple kind of thing. The recipe I had said to cook it for 2 hours. That seemed quite a long time to me. So I didn't cook it that long. Libby, is 2 hours standard to cook it?
My grandma's recipe is 3 hours.
3 hours. Being of the modern kind, wanting sort of, crisp, tender vegetables, I only cooked mine about 20 minutes. But I guess cooking it that long would, I guess if the cabbage were older, that might be a really good way to make it taste good. It actually was very, very good with the cabbage and apples. I used sweet and low instead of real sugar, though. One recipe I had called for lingonberry jam in it, or red currant jam to use instead of the sugar. So here it is in the pan, ready to be steamed, and here it is all nicely steamed, not 3 hours, but 20 minutes. So the cabbage and red apples. Here is dill, which is very delicious with salmon, which is a classic Scandinavian dish. And here is a scene from the bio tapestry showing a meal being consumed. And of course, the Scandinavians thoroughly believe that the bio tapestry, which was done by the Normans, is reflective of Viking society. And you have to agree. Here is a guy drinking from a Viking horn, Viking drinking horn. Here's another one holding a Viking drinking horn. And one of the accounts of their meals I read said that they were very barbarous. They didn't use any knives or forks or spoons, and they just ate with their knives or their hands. Here he's drinking his soup from a bowl. So here's a meal taking place in the bio tapestry. Women took over the manufacturing that was done. Men really didn't. Men would get involved in the trade when they would, for example, dry the cod that would be and pickle the herring that would be an enormous item of trade that they could trade all over their trading routes in the North Sea. But women were responsible for that other really main good for trading, which is textiles. They would spin and weave the wool into homespun, and the women clothed the entire population from the cradle to the grave. And so wool would have been enormously important in Scandinavia because it keeps you very warm. And so spinning and weaving all of this cloth to keep their family warm to survive was very important. A standard of trade in Iceland was the textile goods, which ended up replacing silver when the Icelanders traded off all their silver and they didn't have any left. And so they used the textiles as trading goods, as standards of trade. The women would produce them, shearing the sheep, spinning the thread, weaving and fulling the cloth. Fulling the cloth involves soaking it in urine and then pounding it and then dyeing it. So the economics of homespun was very important to the survival of Iceland. In Iceland, this homespun cloth became a medium of exchange, and it was exported for profit. It was also used for sails on the ships, which was very important. It was used to make sacks to pack the cargo, wall hangings, tents were made out of it. They made the wool into booths for the Althing, for bedding and clothing and cloaks and coats. Fulled wool, which could be a very matted wool. It's not quite a felt, but it's, I'm trying to think of, boiled wool. Have you ever seen boiled wool? It's fashionable to make jackets out of boiled wool. It makes it very thick and interesting texture, but they could even make armor out of that fulled wool. A particular kind of shaggy coat made in Iceland became a significant item of export, and it became a fashion in Norway as it was produced in Iceland. My guess is they made these shaggy wool coats as a kind of ersatz fur, a kind of faux fur coat that became very popular and fashionable. Well, here is a loom that they would have used. This is an ancient loom from the Pharaohs, and it's interesting. It's a vertical loom, and it has all these different parts that can pull the wool out, which will allow them to make patterns out of the wool. And here is the yarn as it's gathered on this, wound around in hanks on this pole, whatever it is, and then the threads are threaded onto the loom and hanging down here, so that on these weights on the bottom. Okay, here are some embroidery needles and sewing needles of different kinds. This is a bronze needle, and let's see, it doesn't describe what this is. This is an iron needle, and here is a silver needle to be used for embroidery and embellishing fabrics. But most of the fabrics that I found pictures of had the patterns actually woven into them. I think I showed you some last time that were embroidered, though. Here's one with a pattern woven into it, a very elaborate geometric pattern. I actually wore my Norwegian sweater today, thinking that I would show you Norwegian knitting, and as it was practiced, except that in my research and trying to figure out if the Vikings knitted, I had to come up with the answer that they did not. They did not seem to know the art of knitting in the Viking Age. And what I found out about knitting was that apparently the first time that a kind of proto-knitting exists is in about 300 AD in Egypt, interestingly, in Coptic Egypt. And they didn't actually knit it. It was more a precursor of knitting that involved knotting it all together, but they could still make a very flexible kind of a garment that could stretch and had the qualities of a knitted garment. Then it appears that this kind of knotting was taken up by the Muslim world, by the Islamic world, who used it with cotton and silk throughout the Islamic world. And then I don't know exactly how the knowledge was transferred to medieval Europe, but the first time that knitting and knitting needles appear in medieval Europe is in the 13th century. And the first appearance is in works of art where we see pictures of the Virgin Mary knitting with knitting needles. And so then we know that Europe had knitting when they show the Virgin doing this knitting. But it must have been an incredible discovery, the art of knitting. And I suspect it came through the Islamic trading that the Vikings were doing, either in that way or it came through the Crusades and through the Crusader states in the Holy Land, the knowledge of knitting. But once the Northern world had that knowledge of knitting, they latched onto it just enormously as wonderfully supportive of their culture. And we know now that the fishermen's sweaters that the Irish wear and knitting all over the Shetland Islands with the Shetland wool, it was an enormous improvement to the woven cloth to have knitting. But as early as I could trace it, and I still have a couple more books I want to check into, but as early as I could trace it in Europe was to the 13th century. Although some people have guessed that the Vikings knew how, but nothing has been found among the Viking artifacts that shows knitting. All of the Viking cloth that's been discovered so far is woven like this. So apparently they didn't know the art of knitting, which is kind of surprising. Here are some spindles, and this is a burnt clay, and of course you would need, here's a side view of the spindle, and here's the top view of the spindle, and this is what you would pull the thread through, to work it through to turn the wool and spin it into a thread, so that you could turn it into a thread in order to weave it. You'd have to stretch out that yarn. And this is a weaving shuttle that, of course, you would pass back and forth under and over the strands of yarn that would be in the loom to weave it back and forth. So this is a shuttle to pull the thread through. Again, those particular shaggy coats in Iceland were invented by women to replace fur. The women would be responsible for making all the clothes that the whole society would wear. And as we said, cloth became a medium of exchange as the silver ran out at the end of the 11th century. For example, the law speaker in Iceland paid with 200 ells of homespun plus half the fines for designated crimes. And an ell was the length of a grown man's forearm from elbow to fingertips. Okay, so that was an ell. That would be a length of the cloth. In the 13th century, however, dried fish replaced the homespun as a medium of exchange. But homespun dominated the export trade, and the shaggy coats were especially prized abroad. Fixed standards of quality had to be devised, and fixed standards of measurements. And so an ell, of course, was the length of a man's forearm from elbow to fingertip. A double ell equals a yard, and we still use the yard in English-speaking measurement of textiles. And here are some of the clothes that would have been woven. I wonder if that's a shaggy coat. What do you think? It's a coarse woolen cloak, and this is all it's been identified as. It makes you wonder if it's one of those shaggy coats from Iceland. And of course, this is from our 19th century book, which wouldn't have known about modern studies of women's weaving that had been done. Here is a woolen skirt held together by a striped band, and here is a cap that is wonderfully fitting to the head, a woolen shawl, and another cap. And of course, caps would have been very important to keep your head warm, because you want to keep your head warm in this climate. Here is a very elaborate woman's skirt and bodice of wool, and a cap that she would have worn. And here is a man's trousers of woven woolen cloth, and the woven cloth with various designs in it. Here is a sort of herringbone weave, fragments of woolen cloth that the women would have woven. And here is some more. Here is a woolen shirt or blouse that the women would have made, and a woven border at the bottom of the shirt, a very elaborate herringbone border, and a pattern of the body of the shirt, which is an elaborate pattern that would have been, it would have been difficult to weave a pattern like that to make the clothes for men that would be like this, where a more elaborate one is fur trimmed, but the women would make all of these clothes. And here would be the clothes the women would make for themselves. And this is the kind of, here are actually two women's outfits. I'm sorry I didn't get more of that red one there. Okay. Now, Judith Jesh, before I get on to Judith Jesh and her rather contrary view, I wanted to mention two newspaper articles that had to do with the food that I was mentioning. And this article was in the paper just January 28th about the need for getting enough sun to get enough vitamin D. And it immediately popped into my mind that, hey, how did the Vikings get their vitamin D if they have these long, long winters and not very much strong enough sunlight essentially from September through May. And in fact, there's a map with this article that shows inadequate sunlight for vitamin D September through March in the Arctic areas in the north of Canada, in north of 50 degrees north. And so that's inadequate, and that's exactly where the Vikings lived. So how did these Vikings survive that winter with a terrible vitamin deficiency like that? And lo and behold, the answer is in the food they ate, because what are the foods that carry the most natural vitamin D? Salmon has the most vitamin D. It has 300 international units. 1 tablespoon of cod liver oil has 360 international units of vitamin D. So cod liver oil, and they must have eaten lots of cod liver. They ate tons of cod. And salmon, mackerel, sardines, and eel. All of those have enormous amounts of vitamin D, and those are major elements of the Viking diet. So you can see why they would have done that. Other things that have a lot of vitamin D in them are milk, beef liver, whole eggs, but not nearly as much as the salmon and the mackerel and the eel. And so here is how they survived the winter. It's in the fish that they ate, and which was a very interesting thing, I think, to find. And then this other article is dietary advice on eating a Mediterranean diet, and this is from last December, saying that the ideal diet is more like a Mediterranean diet, but it's also like a Viking diet, because listen to what is in it. It's rich in vegetables and fruits, and, cabbage and turnips are vegetables. And apples are fruits, and so they ate enormous amounts of that. Whole grains, and especially barley and oats, which are the grains they grew and they eat. Nuts. It says unsaturated vegetable oils, although the Vikings ate tons of butter and animal fats, but they still remained very healthful. Beans, like our yellow pea soup that we saw, legumes, beans like that. But not red meat. Well, I don't know if pork is not red meat, but they ate mostly pork and fish, but they ate so much fish. And so if you look at the diet, walnuts, another one, walnuts are especially rich in polyunsaturates, including safflower and mustard oil, which they used a lot of. Consuming a moderate amount of alcohol, which they surely did, probably more than a moderate amount, but a diet rich in fruits and vegetables, and especially green leafy vegetables. And so the Vikings had a very healthy diet, even though it's simple and it's not elaborate. There's not a huge variety, but it seems to be a very healthy diet. Well, Judith Jess's view of the Vikings in her book, Women in the Viking Age, she argues quite the opposite view from Jenny Jockins. She says that in the 9th and 10th centuries, large numbers of women were involved in Viking settlement of previously uninhabited or sparsely inhabited lands. North and West Scotland, the Faroes, Iceland, and Greenland. She says that women were also involved in voyages to North America, and the evidence is clear in the sagas and Lonsau Meadows, the Newfoundland settlement, which had women's tools like spindles and spinning whorls and elements and cooking pots that were women's. Most of the women traveled as members of a household headed by a man, but women could also play this role of pioneers, organizing transport and making decisions. Women accompanied men on trading and raiding voyages to densely populated areas, and there's clear evidence of that. They went in smaller numbers than those with the colonists, but still they went on the raiding and trading voyages. The clearest picture is in England. Although there were few in the 9th century, in the first attacks on England, there were more women coming to England in the process of settlement. There's a similar picture for Ireland and Normandy, that a lot of women accompanied those men. In Frankland, women could accompany a traveling Viking army, but few stayed. In Russia, traders and raiders included women. Some perhaps were acquired en route as slaves. The Viking Age loosened the ties that bound people to their home districts, and we see the Vikings engaging in much more traveling and moving around. The Viking Age provided new opportunities to travel and to learn languages and acquire wealth and observe other cultures, and women participated in those enterprises. Scandinavian women at home likewise profited. Archaeology and runestones are the best sources, including the Oseberg burial, which shows that aristocratic women who stayed home in Scandinavia could have great wealth and standing in their community. In the prosperous centers of trade in Birka, Kaupand, and Hedeby, women were well represented. And women could also be merchants or craftspeople, alone or as partners of their husbands. In fact, the trade and industry of the Viking Age provided new opportunities for women, and Christianity also provided new opportunities. A number of women's runic inscriptions increases after the conversion, and there are runic inscriptions for daughters as well as sons. Women built and repaired bridges and causeways and went on pilgrimages. And after the Christian era, more men commissioned runic inscriptions for their wives. In the myths and the sagas, women, whether goddesses, giantesses, or ordinary women, were decorative or peripheral. A few skaldic poems were actually written by female poets and suggest a tradition of poetry by women. The warring women, descendants of the Valkyries of Norse myth, were combative armed women, and there is a heroic fantasy of the armed female guardian spirit of the male warrior. Saxo Grammaticus has a myth of the virago, a woman who wears male clothing and carries weapons, a vengeful figure of the female insiders goading men to violence. But Saxo Grammaticus is a historian, and there's no romantic treatment of women in the sagas, nor are they portrayed as sex objects. Rather, they're portrayed more as real women. Women in particular were captured and enslaved, but men could be also. Women could be victims of human sacrifice, but men could also be. But in the Viking Age, there was a window of opportunity, and some women took advantage of it. Some women went a Viking with their men and became these heroic Viking women. If you want to read a story of the most adventurous Viking woman, look in your Vinland Sagas book about Freydis Eric's daughter. There's a whole chapter on Freydis, and she actually led one of the excursions to the New World. She organized it, she made partnerships, she led it there, and she killed all her partners when she got there, and she got her husband to kill all their followers. And when her husband and his men refused to kill her partner's wives, her reply was, "Give me an axe." She killed them herself. So Freydis, Eric's daughter, this may not be a true story. Who knows if it's a true story or not, but it certainly portrays heroic women who do the same kinds of things that men do on their travels throughout the known world. So we have an example of women of that kind. Okay, I think we're just about out of time. Next week we're going to do Viking sagas, and we're going to look at them in much more detail and see what all the different kinds of sagas that were written and what they tell stories about. So we'll see you next week.